The words echoed through the hospital room like a slap. "Dad, don't listen to this failure." My brother Ryan said it with the careless cruelty he had perfected over 43 years. His voice carried across the ICU room, where our father lay connected to machines tracking every breath, every heartbeat. I stood there holding a thick manila folder, watching Ryan step between me and Dad's bed like a guard protecting something valuable from something worthless. "Ryan," I said quietly, "this isn't the time or the place." "When is the time, Marcus?" Ryan's eyes locked onto mine with the same contempt I'd known since childhood. "When are you going to stop pretending you actually matter in this family?" The machines beeped at steady intervals. I could see the pulse on the monitor. Dad's eyes were closed, but I knew he was listening. He'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for 3 days, but the doctors said he could hear everything. Ryan wanted him to hear this. That's why his voice kept rising. That's why his reactions grew sharper. I could feel people watching. They weren't helping. They were just watching. Why were they just watching? And no one stopped him. The nurse at the monitoring station looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. My father's brother, Uncle Jim, shifted in his chair by the window but said nothing. He looked unwell, disturbed but still silent. Ryan's wife, Patricia, stood behind him like a shadow, quiet yet seemingly supportive of whatever cruelty Ryan was about to unleash. If you've ever been erased in a room full of people, you already know what that feels like. Ryan had spent our entire lives building toward this moment, the successful brother, the golden child, the one who followed Dad into the construction, business and turned it into an empire. I was the brother who left home at 18 and never came back, the one who chose teaching instead of business, books instead of blueprints, classrooms instead of construction sites. The brother Ryan had been waiting 43 years to destroy in front of the one person whose opinion mattered to him more than anything else, our dying father. And still, his careless cruelty didn't stop. If someone of your own blood called you a failure, would you have stood there in silence, or would you have fought back? I genuinely want to know. Put yourself in my place and be honest. Tell me in the comments. I'll read every single one, because what happened next, this was only the beginning. The silence stretched between the beeps of Dad's heart monitor. No one spoke. That's when it hit me. This wasn't grief. This was timing. Ryan wasn't mourning. He was making a move. He'd planned this moment carefully. Dad had been unconscious for most of the morning, but as soon as he'd shown signs of awareness, Ryan had started talking about the business, about the will, about which son had earned the right to carry on the family legacy, about which son was a disappointment. I didn't react. I filed it away. Every conversation over the past 3 days, every time Ryan had positioned himself as the responsible son, dealing with the difficult decisions, every time he'd spoken about me in the third person while I was standing right there, as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a son saying goodbye to his father. What I didn't know yet was that I'd been preparing for this moment longer than Ryan had been planning it. The folder in my hands contained 20 years of documentation, 20 years of careful record-keeping, 20 years of proving that the failure had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. But first, I had to let Ryan finish his performance, because what Ryan didn't understand was that Dad wasn't as gone as he looked. It was about who stayed clean when the beeping was the loudest thing in the room. Dad had called me 6 months ago, which was unusual. We talked maybe 3 times a year, always brief, always polite. Ryan handled the family communications. Ryan managed Dad's business relationships. Ryan was the son who stayed close to home. But that phone call had been different. "Marcus," Dad had said, his voice weaker than I remembered, "I need you to do something for me. Something Ryan can't know about." At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I realize he was counting on me to do what Ryan couldn't be trusted to do. Dad had been watching Ryan for years, using the company like a personal bank account, sliding personal expenses into business lines, draining what 3 generations had built, documents no family wants to see, papers that showed a pattern going back 5 years. Ryan had been stealing from his own father, not directly, not obviously, but through consulting fees paid to companies he owned, through equipment purchases that ended up at his personal properties, through expense accounts that funded his lifestyle while the business struggled. Dad had hired a private investigator, a forensic accountant, all without Ryan's knowledge, because Dad had been hoping he was wrong about his golden son. That's when I realized Dad wasn't protecting Ryan. He was measuring him. "The business papers need to be signed," Ryan said, pulling a leather portfolio from his briefcase. We were still standing in Dad's ICU room. Dad's breathing was shallow, but steady. The afternoon sun slanted through the hospital blinds, casting shadows across the folder in my hands. Legal documents don't lie. People do. Ryan opened his portfolio and spread papers across the rolling table beside Dad's bed. Partnership agreements, transfer documents, signature pages with yellow sticky notes marking where Dad needed to sign. Everything's been prepared, Ryan continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when closing construction deals. The lawyers have structured everything to minimize tax implications. Clean transfer of ownership to the surviving partner. He sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the car. Surviving partner, I repeated quietly. That's how these things work, Marcus. Dad and I have been 50-50 partners for 15 years. When one partner dies, the other inherits the whole business. It's standard. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't even look at Dad. Uncle Jim looked up from his chair by the window. 50-50 partners? Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. Marcus wouldn't understand the legal complexities. He's never been involved in the business side. That's when I realized they'd already rehearsed this. Ryan had spent the past 3 days positioning himself as the responsible son dealing with Dad's final affairs. He'd brought legal documents. He'd discussed tax strategies. He'd painted a picture of a dying man who needed his business-savvy son to handle the complicated transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. They weren't offering options. They were presenting a decision. Dad's signature just needs to be witnessed, Ryan said, pulling a pen from his jacket pocket. That single detail changed everything. Ryan wasn't waiting for Dad to wake up and make his own decisions. He was planning to guide Dad's hand while Dad was semi-conscious, get him to sign documents he couldn't fully understand, and have those signatures witnessed by family members who trusted Ryan's interpretation of what was happening. He'd already decided Jim would be the witness because he trusted Ryan. Ryan, Uncle Jim said slowly, maybe we should wait until your father's more alert. The lawyers said we can't wait, Ryan replied quickly. The hospital's talking about moving him to hospice. If Dad passes without signing these documents, everything goes to probate. The business could be tied up for years. Employees will lose their jobs. Customers will go to competitors. Everything Dad built will collapse. Ryan was broadcasting false urgency to a room full of grieving relatives, hoping emotional pressure would make everyone go along with his plan. But Ryan had made a critical mistake. He'd assumed Dad was unconscious. Dad's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Ryan with startling clarity. What documents? Dad asked, his voice weak but unmistakable. Ryan's confidence faltered for just a second. The partnership transfer documents, Dad. We talked about this. Everything needs to be formalized. We talked about this, Dad repeated slowly. When? Silence. Ryan was about to learn that panic doesn't create authority. Inside that manila envelope Dad had given me 6 months ago was documentation that would change everything Ryan thought he knew about the family business, about Dad's plans, and about which son had actually been paying attention to what mattered. Quiet people don't argue. They document. And Dad had been preparing while everyone else was praying. I'd spent 20 years as a high school history teacher in Denver, Colorado. My job was to help teenagers understand that actions have consequences, that choices made in private eventually become public, and that character is what you do when you think no one is watching. I'd also spent 20 years receiving quarterly reports from Dad's business, not because I was involved in operations, but because I was listed as a minority shareholder. 10% ownership in a company I'd never worked for, inherited from my grandfather's will. Ryan had apparently forgotten about that 10%. And Ryan had apparently forgotten that shareholders get copies of everything. Fraud doesn't fall apart all at once. It cracks in one place, then it spreads. Ryan didn't suddenly change. He'd been consistent for 15 years. Dad changed. He stopped trusting. He started documenting. 6 months ago, when Dad had called me with that unusual request, he'd sent me 23 boxes of business records going back 5 years. Bank statements, expense reports, invoices, receipts, everything Ryan had submitted for reimbursement, everything Ryan had charged to company accounts, everything Ryan had justified as business expenses. Dad hadn't asked me to analyze the records. He had asked me to keep them safe. Dad had looked at me that day like he was seeing me for the first time, not as the failure, but as the son who stayed honest, because Dad had already hired professionals to analyze them, and what they'd found was damning. Dad, you're tired, Ryan said, his voice taking on a tone I recognized from childhood. the tone he used when he was trying to manage a situation that wasn't going his way. "You need to rest. Let me handle the paperwork." Dad's eyes stayed focused on Ryan's face. "What paperwork?" "The documents we discussed, Dad. The partnership transfer, everything we planned." "We planned?" Dad's voice was getting stronger. "Ryan, when exactly did we plan this?" Ryan reached toward the papers on the bedside table, but Dad raised his hand slightly. Even connected to IV tubes and monitoring wires, Dad's gesture carried authority. "Leave them." That was the lie he needed to be true. Ryan had spent 3 days telling everyone that Dad had approved these transfers, that they'd discussed the legal strategy, that everything was according to Dad's wishes. But Dad had never approved anything. Ryan had created the documents himself, working with lawyers who specialized in business succession, preparing everything Dad would need to sign to make Ryan the sole owner of a company worth $3.2 million. Deadlines are how control disguises itself as help. "The hospital said we need to finalize everything today," Ryan pressed, "before you're moved to another facility." "What hospital administrator told you that?" Uncle Jim asked. Ryan's face flushed slightly. "The social worker. She explained the legal requirements." Dad was still watching Ryan's face. "Call her in here." "Dad, she's busy. The point is..." "Call her in here, Ryan." Ryan's hands were shaking now. His carefully constructed narrative was collapsing because Dad wasn't playing the role Ryan had assigned him. Dad was supposed to be weak, confused, grateful for his successful son's help in managing complicated affairs. Instead, Dad was asking questions Ryan couldn't answer. But Ryan's plan to control the family business hadn't started with Dad's illness. It had been building for years. What I'd thought was normal family hierarchy had actually been something much more calculated. Dad had told me, during that phone call 6 months ago, about conversations he'd overheard between Ryan and Patricia. Conversations where Ryan had complained about having to wait for the old man to die to really expand the business. Where Ryan had talked about all the changes he'd make once I'm in charge. Where Ryan had said he was tired of pretending that Marcus mattered to the family legacy. Ryan hadn't been building a business partnership with Dad. He'd been waiting for Dad to die so he could claim what he believed was rightfully his. The forensic accountant Dad had hired had found evidence that Ryan was already operating as if he owned the entire company, making major financial decisions without Dad's approval, committing the company to contracts that primarily benefited Ryan's other business interests. Ryan had been using Dad's trust to fund his own empire, one unauthorized expense at a time. Dad had realized, in the final months of his illness, that his golden son saw Dad's death as a business opportunity, that Ryan was planning to use Dad's grief and physical weakness to manipulate him into signing away everything their family had built. Every weakness had been noted, every moment saved for later. I stepped forward and placed my manila folder on the bedside table, next to Ryan's leather portfolio. "Dad asked me to bring this," I said quietly. He thought I'd argue. I didn't. I let the silence do it first. "What is that?" Ryan demanded. Dad was watching me carefully. "Open it, Marcus." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a forensic accounting report dated 3 weeks ago. 23 pages analyzing Ryan's business expenses over the past 5 years. Ryan's face went white. "Ryan, do you know what a forensic report is?" He looked confused by the question. "Marcus, this isn't the time for..." "They find what people try to bury. And Ryan, you didn't bury it deep enough. 6 months ago, Dad hired one. He reviewed every expense you submitted for the past 5 years, every receipt, every invoice, every dollar you thought no one would question." Ryan started to speak, but I held up the report. $127,000 in personal expenses charged to the business pool. Installation at your house, Hawaii vacation, and your daughter's wedding, paid for with company money. I looked at Uncle Jim, then back at Ryan. And that was just what we could prove on paper. Ryan's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles in his neck. Dad's eyes opened fully, focused on Ryan with devastating clarity. "I didn't raise you to steal from me, Ryan." The room went silent except for the machines. But here's what really caught the forensic accountant's attention. "Ryan, the consulting fees." I pulled out a second document. $85,000 paid to your wife's company for marketing consultation, $65,000 paid to your brother-in-law for legal services, $43,000 paid to a shell corporation registered under your daughter's name for administrative support. Uncle Jim was staring at Ryan now. Patricia had taken a step backward. You didn't fail because you were careless. You failed because you underestimated the one person you thought you owned. I turned to Dad. Dad, should I read the part about the equipment that disappeared from the job sites? Dad nodded slowly. Company trucks that somehow ended up registered under Ryan's personal name. Construction equipment purchased by the business but stored permanently at Ryan's private properties. Tools and materials that were charged to customer projects but never delivered to the job sites. Ryan was breathing hard now, his face cycling through anger, panic, and something that looked like desperation. "This is insane," he said finally. "Marcus, you don't understand how business works. Those were legitimate expenses." "Were they?" I asked. I pulled out the final document from the folder. "Because Dad also hired a private investigator, someone who photographed your house, your properties, your lifestyle, someone who documented exactly where every piece of missing equipment ended up." I handed the folder to Dad, who took it with surprisingly steady hands. "Dad, would you like to tell Ryan about the new partnership documents you had drawn up last month? The ones that remove him as a partner and install professional management to run the company?" Ryan stumbled backward as if I'd hit him. "The ones that transfer his 10% ownership to me and restructure the business to prevent any single person from treating it as their personal bank account?" Dad's eyes stayed locked on Ryan's face. "Ryan," Dad said quietly, "you were never my partner. You were my employee, and you're fired." The silence in the hospital room was broken only by the steady beep of Dad's heart monitor. Ryan stood frozen, staring at the man he'd spent 15 years systematically stealing from. The father he'd planned to manipulate on his deathbed. The business owner who'd been quietly, carefully, methodically building a case against his own son. "Dad," Ryan whispered, "I never meant—" "Yes, you did," Dad replied. "You meant every dollar, every forged expense report, every time you used my trust to fund your lifestyle while my employees struggled to make payroll." I opened the folder and pulled out one more document. "Ryan, this was filed yesterday, signed this morning. You're barred from every company property and account, effective immediately. Don't make me take it to the next step." Ryan's wife Patricia grabbed his arm. "Ryan, we need to go." "We're not finished," Ryan said, but his voice had lost all its authority. "Yes, you are," Uncle Jim said from his chair by the window. "You're finished, son." As Ryan and Patricia gathered their useless legal documents and left the room, Dad reached for my hand. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see what you were worth." "You saw it, Dad. That's why you called me. Help is offered. Control is taken." Dad died 2 days later, peacefully, with me holding his hand and Uncle Jim reading him stories from his favorite book about the history of Oklahoma. Ryan contested the will, of course. He hired lawyers, claimed Dad had been mentally incompetent, argued that 20 years of family business partnership couldn't be undone by suspicious expense reports. The legal battle lasted 18 months. Ryan lost everything. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The private investigator's documentation was comprehensive. The new partnership documents were ironclad, drawn up by Dad's lawyers while Dad was demonstrably competent, witnessed by 3 independent parties, and notarized according to strict legal standards. Justice doesn't shout. It lets time do the talking. I sold the construction business 6 months later, used the money to establish a scholarship fund for students who want to become teachers, named it after Dad, who'd learned the difference between financial success and personal integrity. Ryan moved to Texas with Patricia, started over where his reputation hadn't followed him. I heard he was working as a project manager for someone else's company, earning hourly wages, living in an apartment, learning what it felt like to build something instead of taking it. Some of us are older, yes, but we're not blind. We can tell the difference between people who mourn a loss and people who calculate an opportunity. If you've ever been talked about like you weren't there, you already know why this story matters. Ryan learned that some quiet brothers who seem like easy targets have spent decades learning to spot the difference between love and leverage. Family isn't about blood or business success. It's about who shows up when life gets hard, who stays loyal when staying costs something, who chooses honesty over advantage. And when experience is cornered, it doesn't plead, it decides. So ask yourself, what would you have done?